Welcome back! It's really good to see you guys again. I'm excited to teach you about graphing sine and cosine functions. So we are just going to use all the things that we learned on Monday. So recap on vocab. We learned about the amplitude. That's how high the graph goes, right? From the midline, it goes up and down, the amplitude. Midline is the line that goes through the middle of the graph. Period is to take one full cycle, how long it takes to take one full cycle. And frequency is how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So we're going to look at all that stuff right now, and we're going to learn how do we actually graph. So this is how we do it. I'm going to start with y equals 2 sine of x, and we're going to find all the things that we just talked about. So the first thing, and I always, for every problem, write these things down, so you're going to be writing them down also. I want to find the amplitude. I want to find the midline. I want to find the period. Those are my key three things. So amplitude is this right here. This is the amplitude. So my amplitude, A equals 2. Great. My midline, that's the number being added here. There's nothing there. So that's y equals 0. Awesome. My period, I do 2 pi over b. 2 pi over, b is the number here. Since there's no number, it's a 1. So I put 1. I simplify that. The period is 2 pi. Okay, so now let's graph this. So to start with, is it a sine or cosine? Sine starts at the midline. Cosine starts at the amplitude. And you might want to take notes on this. Okay. This is what we're going to do. So for the sine, we're starting at the midline. So the midline's y equals 0. That is right here. So that's just my x-axis. Cool. Nothing has to be done there. Sine starts there. So at 0, at the origin, I'm going to make a point. Then I have to do my period next. Okay. So for my period, that means I make a mark at 2 pi. That's going to be my fourth dash. Remember on the unit circle, the 4 points? So I like to go halfway from 0 to there, make a note there, and then halfway here and halfway here. Those are going to be my 4 key points. So I just want to make sure that that stands out. You're making on your x-axis. You start at whatever the period is, and then you're breaking that up. So you break it up in half, and then half here and half there. So you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 after the 0. Okay, now we're going to start our first point of sine, so I start here at 0. At the next dash I made, I'm going to go up to the amplitude, positive 2. So I go up 1, 2, and make a point. Then I come back to the midline. Then at the next one, I go down 2, 1, 2, make a point, and then I come back to the midline, and I sketch it in. And that's how you graph. You can continue this direction too if you want to. So you just go to negative 2 pi, halfway, half and half. Then from here, you go to the next line and you go down 2. Because see, it can't go back up. It has to continue waving. So it's going back to the middle, up 2, back to the middle. So it always is going to look like a wave. If yours comes out looking like this, boom, you know you made a mistake. You should never have an M in your graph. So the next one we're going to do is y equals 3 sine 2x. Okay, so my amplitude, this number right here, amplitude is 3. So A equals 3. My midline, there's nothing being added here, so the midline is still at 0. My period, I do 2 pi over b. B is the number in front of the x. So 2 pi over 2 simplifies to pi. So I draw my midline in. That's right here on the x-axis. Don't have to draw it because it's already there. I make my first point, or first we can even say dash, at 0. Then I go to pi because that's my period. So pi. Now from there I need my other dashes. So I go in the middle, dash, and then middle of this half, middle of that half. This is where my dashes are going to go. So I now have to do, it's a sine graph, So sine starts at the midline. Amplitude is 3, so I go to the next dash and I go up 3. 1, 2, 3. Back to the midline. Next dash, down 3. 1, 2, 3. Back to the midline. And I sketch it in, and that's my graph. And you can continue if you want. You would go to the next dash, right? Go up 3, back to the midline. Down 3, back to the midline. Notice that it's not pointy. So I'm not drawing it in like this. Boom, boom. Okay, it has to be a curve just like a parabola would be. So it's a wave. Okay, 2 more and then we're all done and you're going to practice. Y equals sine 2x minus 1. Let's find all the things we just said are important. So the first thing I always find is my amplitude. Good job. So my amplitude, no number here, that's a 1. Amplitude is 1. Next I find my midline. Is there a number being added at the end? There is a number. So the midline is negative 1. Y equals negative 1. So I'm going to go to negative 1 and draw a dashed line across there so that I know that that's my midline. Okay? Now, last thing is my period. Period is 2 pi over b. What's my b? My b is 2 because that's in front of the x. Simplifies to pi. So I'm going to go over to pi. Let's make a dash at 0. Always, always, always. Go over to pi. Make a dash. Halfway, dash. Halfway here, halfway here. Always end up with the origin and then 4 dashes after it. Okay. So sine starts at the midline. So instead of starting at 0, I'm starting here at the midline. I move over to my next point, and then the A is 1, so I go up 1. Back to my midline. Next point, down 1. Back to my midline. And if I sketch it in, it creates a nice curve where this is in the middle of the graph. Okay. Last one we're going to do. Y equals 4 cosine x. Okay. So what is my amplitude? Amplitude is 4. That's the number in front. You may be wondering why I'm wearing these. These are my Math Nerd glasses number 2. Just throwing it out there. My midline, no number there, so y equals 0. And my period, 2 pi over, no number there, so it's 1. And that just simplifies to 2 pi. All right, so let's get started. Midline's at 0, so I don't have to, that's the x-axis, I don't have to draw it in. Make my first dash here. Period is 2 pi, so 2 pi. Go halfway, halfway, halfway. Okay, now we're going to make our points. This is cosine. Cosine doesn't start at the midline, it starts at the amplitude. So instead of starting here, I'm going to start 4 up from there. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I make my first point. I go to the next dash, back at the midline. I go to the next dash, down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I go to the next dash, back at the midpoint. I go to the next dash, up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. When you sketch it in, make sure you don't make it pointy. Picture that it continues over here, okay? A little more like that. Okay? So you can kind of see what's happening there. So it's almost like the graph got shifted, right? Because it would be like that, and that would be the sign. So it got shifted over just a little bit, okay? Let's do one more like that just to make sure we understand it. Okay. We've got y equals negative 2 cosine x plus 1. Alrighty. So I go through all my things. Amplitude. Amplitude is 2, but I note that it's negative. Remember, amplitude's always a positive number. Midline. Is there a number being added at the end? Yes, there is. So midline, y equals 1. Period. 2 pi over b. 2 pi over b. There's no number in there, so there's a 1. And that's just 2 pi. Fabulous. Okay, so now we draw our midline first. Do that in pink. So the midline is at 1. Pink like my hair. Okay. cosine doesn't start at the midline. Oh, we have to do our dashes. I almost forgot. Period is 2 pi. So I do a dash at the origin, a dash at 2 pi. I go halfway, halfway, halfway. Okay. Now, this is the beauty of it. We are going to, instead of starting at the midline, we're starting at the amplitude. But instead of going up, because it's negative, we go down. So normally I would go up 2 and start there. But since it's negative, I go from the midline down 2 and I start there. So from the midline, I count to down 2, and that's where I start. The next point, I'm back at the midline. The next point, I go up 2, 1, 2 from the midline. The next point, I'm back at the midline. And the next point, I go down 2 from the midline. And then curve it in, curve it in. Okay. On Delta Math, what's going to be pretty cool is that you don't have to actually draw in the curve. It curves it for you. I'm going to show you an example of me doing it on Delta Math, but I wanted you to see me physically doing it as well. Hey guys, now I'm going to show you how we do this on Delta Math. So we look at the equation. It says on the axis below, make an appropriate scale and graph exactly one cycle of the trigonometric function y equals 4 sine 2x. One cycle means it's those dashes that I showed you. That's exactly what we're going to do. So we have to find those same 3 things I just said. Okay, let's do that now. So we are going to, okay, and I'm going to mark it up. Where's the markup? There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do is we look at this equation and we say, what's the amplitude? So remember that this is the amplitude. So amplitude, and you're going to write these down in your notes, amplitude A equals 4. Midline is the number that's being added at the end over here. There's nothing there. So I just put y equals 0. And there we go. And the period, we're going to use the b, the number in front of the x. So for the period, we do 2 pi over b, which is 2. That simplifies to just pi. So now we have those 3 things. Okay. When we think about it, we want to say to ourselves, well, how high does it have to go? It only has to go to 4. So what would be a good scale? A good scale for us would be to count by ones. So I'd put 1 in there because I can go up 1, 2, 3, 4, and down 4. The x-axis, I know I have to get to pi, so whatever my period is, that's what I'm going to put in here. So I can just click pi, and that's going to go right inside there. Okay. Now, I'm going to do that. 1 pi, and I hit done. Now you'll notice this guy popped up right over here, this little pi guy right over here. Can you see him moving? Okay, so we're going to drag him over. My personal preference is, because I have to make those even spaces, is to count by 2s, right? So remember that it's 4 dashes out. So I start here and I count 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and 1, 2. So that would be 4 dashes. 1, 2, 3, 4 from the origin. So I'm going to undo those points just so I remember where that is. And I'm going to drag this guy over to here, just so I know where that is, okay? And then get rid of that point. So now the yellows are the points. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, is this sine or cosine? It's sine, that means it starts at the midline. Remember, midline was at the x-axis here. So I make my first point at the midline. Then I go 2 over, remember I was going by 2s, and I'm going to go up positive 4, because that's the amplitude. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I pop. Then I go 2 over and back at the origin, midline, 2 over, down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 2 over, back at the origin. Notice that it actually sketched it in. Okay, now that's what I want it to look like, and I'm going to submit my answer. And that's how you do it. So you're finding those 3 things, amplitude, midline, and period. You have to set your period right there. Notice they did it by 3 spaces. That's fine, as long as it's the same number of spaces. I like 2, they did 3. Have fun, and I will see you later.